So the way we work has changed a lot recently. You and I, we're probably working remotely. If you're watching this in 2020 and I don't know, maybe forevermore, you may not go back to an office. I don't know. But the way we work, we're not getting the FaceTime we did before. And that's with your colleagues, but it's also the same probably with your customers as well. And in this video, I want to talk about identities. And really, it's awesome that we're bringing these customers into platforms like Microsoft Teams to be able to chat and collaborate on files. But internally, it's been a standard for a while now that we need to enable multi-factor authentication to secure people logging in and no rogue actors trying to log in your user's behalf. But what I see still that a lot of organizations haven't done is securing their external and guest users, for Active Directory, for things like Microsoft Teams and so on, with that same lens. They're not using multi-factor authentication. So in this video, I want to show you how simple it is to set that up, and we'll have a look at the user experience as well. All right, so let's just spend a minute just setting the scene of what we're going to achieve here to show multi-factor authentication for guests. And I'm here inside Microsoft Teams, and we've got a team for top secret projects, super top secret squirrel stuff. Nobody can see this unless they've been invited to this team. But not only is this going to be for internal users, but we also want to add in guest users as well. But our guest users today just aren't that secure. And this is a top secret project, isn't it? So we want to make sure that we've added multi-factor authentication to these users. And today they'll just log in with the credentials that we invite them into. In this case, we're going to use a Gmail user as an example. Next thing I want to show you is inside Azure Active Directory. And the reason I'm going to show you this is because it's important to know the different user types. So you can see everyone here is a member. These are all people inside my tenant, inside my organization. But what's going to be really interesting for this demonstration is when we go to user type and then we go to guest. And right now, this is going to have nobody there because we haven't invited anyone into our tenant, into our Azure Active Directory, for example, in Teams, adding them as a guest. But this section is going to be really important because when we start adding this conditional access policy for requiring multi-factor authentication, we're going to be saying that this is for these guest users. And inside Teams, what happens is when we add a guest into a team, is it goes and creates an account here for us, a Azure Active Directory B2B account, business to business. And that's what we can then set the multi-factor authentication policy against. So what I'm going to do quickly is actually go and add this user now in Teams. In Teams from our top secret project, we're going to go ahead, hit the More Options button, and add a member. And here's where we can start adding that guest. So in this case, I'm going to choose just a fake Gmail account for it. And you can see here what it's already doing is it knows, well, hang on a minute, you're not part of our organization. So we're going to have to add you as a guest. And this is the part that we just mentioned. Once I hit add here, that's going to go add this user into Azure Active Directory for us. I can, however, if I want to right now, change some of the information. If I want to change the user's name. For this demo, we'll just leave it as it is and do add. And as you would imagine, like any team that you're creating, now you can go ahead and just hit close. Because they're a guest, though, what you can't do is make them an owner or a member. There's no way of doing that. They're just a guest account. So just bear that in mind. All right, so in Azure AD, let's go ahead and refresh. And look at that. We now have a guest user that's been created inside our Azure Active Directory. And this guest user is what we're going to create this multi-factor authentication for. We can see here, user type is guest. An invitation has been sent to them. They've not accepted it yet. You can go ahead and edit these things. Like, if you want to give it the user a proper first name and last name and all that kind of jazz, you can do that as well. But let's go have a look at it from the end user perspective and go from there. So once you've added in the guest into your team, The workflow is really quite simple. They get an email, as you can see here, which says, hey, you've been added into Contoso into this team, which in this case is our top secret project. What happens then really kind of depends on your identity, if you're already in Azure Active Directory or whatnot. In this case, we're in Gmail, and it's a completely new Gmail account. So it's never had a Microsoft account attached to it or anything like that. So in this case, it's actually going to go ahead and help me set up this to attach my Gmail to a Microsoft account to allow for this simple authentication into the Contoso environment. So once that's all happened, we can now go ahead. Let's just look at opening up Microsoft Teams, and as if we're just logging in somewhat for the first time inside Teams and see what happens to our user identity. So right now, what I'm going to do is let's just get this user account signed in with. So we can see here, it's just prompting me for the password. But so far, we've not been challenged with anything. We're just signing in very simply. There's no multi-factor authentication or anything like that. So if anyone had this person's Gmail credentials, well, they're now in here. They're in the top secret project. They can see all the files, which are, as we know, super confidential. And that's not really the experience we want necessarily for all of our guest users. As we say, that was pretty simple to log in. So now let's go ahead and actually create this multi-factor authentication conditional access policy. So we're now back in Azure Active Directory. We've seen a user logging in without multi-factor authentication. Now let's get a little bit more security on the board and let's set up MFA. This is going to be pretty simple. All we need to do is go down to security and then conditional access. And we have a policy, so we're going to create a new one. You can see there's some here, some preview ones. The Active Directory team are doing a fantastic job of just adding things in that you would expect, like blocking legacy auth, requiring MFA for admins, all good stuff. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to go ahead and do new policy. For new policy, let's give this thing a name that makes sense, like Teams MFA for guest and external users. We then want to go set the assignment, and this has come on a long way. And in the past, we used to create Azure Active Directory dynamic groups for external guests and so on and so forth. Now we can just go ahead and hit all guests and external users. And as when we invite, as we saw, that user into Teams, that guest, that then created that Azure Active Directory B2B account. What that means is now that's going to be seen as a guest user, and we can attach these conditional access policies. So now we've got all guests and external users set. Let's go ahead and choose an application. Of course, you can change this to what you want to control. In my case, I'm just going to do select app and then choose Teams. With Teams selected, we're now just going to choose grant. Of course, there's much more things you can do in here, but for this, we're going to keep it really nice and simple. If you're a guest user and you're trying to log in, we're only going to grant you access if you've used multi-factor authentication. So that is a requirement to log in to our environment. Now with that selected, you can now either report only, which, if you're building this in production, let's be real here. Don't go ahead and just do on, select it to a bunch of users, and then create and enable it, because you may find that what you set up doesn't work exactly how you expect it to be in production. So put it in report only, see what's happening, because you might see some oddities where people are getting MFA prompts when you didn't expect it to happen. I'm actually just going to leave this as report only for a second and show you another quick tool before we actually enable it. So we've now got this created, and what you want to do and what you can do is just try this out, is use the what if tool. And this allows us to say, you know what, if my guest account or this guest account here is logging in and they're trying to get to Microsoft Teams, then let's see what policies actually apply to this user. So we can go ahead and just do what if, for example, and I could see that, well, policies that would apply if it was enabled would be this MFA guest and external user. In the reality, it's going to say here, look, you're going to require multi-factor authentication, but it's currently in the report only state. So you can do that. You can do the report only. You can use this what if tool. Please have a look at these before you go into production. So we're going to come out of the what if. Let's go back to the Teams MFA for guest and external users. Turn this back on again. And now we're going to flip over to the guest user and see what happens when we now log in with this MFA policy enabled. So now let's test out the user experience with the conditional access policy forcing these guest users to use multi-factor authentication to get access. So from the original email, we're just going to go ahead and open Microsoft Teams. What it's then going to do is ask us to authenticate. So signing in to this Contoso tenant. We can then go ahead, put the password in, but what it's going to do this time round is say more information is required. And this is because we now need to set up multi-factor authentication to be able to log in. And then from the additional security verification page, we got a couple of options of how we want to be contacted to be able to set this up. Do we want to use, for example, the authenticator phone, or do we want to use the mobile app? So in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and use my phone number and then ask for it to verify that by text message. After completing all the wizard steps by adding the verification code, what's now going to happen is this guest user will authenticate into Microsoft Teams. You've now seen the steps that a guest user will have to go through to set up multi-factor authentication for the first time. But really, this just made us straight go back into Teams. So we're going to want to just log back out again, and then let's run through logging in again to kind of emulate this guest user logging back into Microsoft Teams, maybe for the first time of the day where they need to come in and collaborate with your organization. But this time is interesting. Now we go ahead and try and log in. What we see is after putting the password in, we now get a challenge from the multi-factor authentication service asking us to put in a code that there's then going to be sent to this guest mobile device that we set up earlier on. And then once we go ahead and verify that code is correct, it's going to go ahead and just log us in. And there we go. That is how you set up multi-factor authentication for your guest and external users coming into your organization's environment. You want to make sure you are protecting your sensitive data, and identity is just part of that story. So hopefully this has been helpful. I'm hoping the demos really give you a good idea of what that experience will look like. So make sure you like, subscribe, and we'll be back next week for another helpful tip and video around Microsoft 365.